On a cold February morning in 2004, in a quiet Washington town where everyone knew their neighbors and children played freely in front yards, a young woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Jennifer Harris, 23 years old, a part-time waitress and devoted mother of 2 small children. She was last seen leaving her shift at the local diner just after midnight, her car keys in hand, her apron folded neatly on the break room table. By dawn, her vehicle was found abandoned on a logging road 12 miles outside of town, driver's door ajar, headlights still burning, her purse on the passenger seat untouched. Jennifer herself was nowhere to be found. The investigation that followed would consume a community, divide a family, and remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades. What really happened to Jennifer Harris in those dark hours before sunrise, and why would it take 20 years for the truth to finally surface? The town of Riverside sat nestled in the Cascade foothills, population just under 8,000, the kind of place where the high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, and the local grocery store still delivered to elderly residents. Timber had built this community in the 1950s, and though the mills had mostly closed by the turn of the century, the working-class pride remained. Streets were lined with modest ranch houses, yards cluttered with pickup trucks and children's toys. The Cascade River ran along the eastern edge of town, its waters dark and swift, fed by snowmelt from the mountains that loomed like silent sentinels in the distance. Jennifer Harris had lived in Riverside her entire life. She graduated from Riverside High in 1999, married her boyfriend Michael Harris 6 months later, and had their first child, a daughter named Emma, before her 20th birthday. Their son, Tyler, arrived 2 years after that. The family rented a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, paint peeling from the window frames, a chain-link fence surrounding a yard where Emma's plastic slide stood tilted in the patchy grass. Michael worked intermittent construction jobs, disappearing for weeks at a time on projects in neighboring counties. Jennifer picked up shifts at the Riverside Diner whenever she could find childcare, usually relying on her mother who lived 3 blocks away. Those who knew Jennifer described her as quiet, maybe too quiet, someone who smiled easily but rarely met your eyes when she did. She wore her light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail most days, favored oversized sweatshirts even in summer, moved through the diner with an efficiency that came from someone who had learned to make herself small. The other waitresses noticed how she flinched at sudden sounds, how she always volunteered to take the late shifts, even though it meant walking to her car alone in the dark parking lot behind the building. February 3, 2004, started like any other Tuesday. Jennifer woke at 6:30 in the morning to get Emma ready for preschool. The sky was heavy with clouds that threatened snow but never quite delivered. She made oatmeal for the children, wiped Tyler's face with a damp cloth, kissed Emma's forehead before walking her the 3 blocks to her mother's house. Michael had left for a job site in Everett before sunrise, wouldn't be home for 3 days. Jennifer returned to the house, cleaned the breakfast dishes, watched morning television with Tyler on her hip. At noon, she dropped him at her mother's as well, told her mother she had a shift from 4 until midnight, asked if she could pick the kids up the next morning. Her mother, Carol Bennett, would later remember that Jennifer seemed distracted that day, kept checking her phone, glancing toward the window. When Carol asked if everything was all right, Jennifer said yes, said everything was fine, said it in a way that made Carol believe the opposite. But Carol didn't push. She had learned over the years that pushing Jennifer only made her retreat further into herself. The afternoon passed. Jennifer arrived at the Riverside Diner at 3:55, 5 minutes early as always. She tied her apron, checked her notepad for a working pen, took her position at the counter. The dinner rush came and went. A few regulars lingered over coffee. By 11:30, the last customer paid and left. Jennifer and another waitress, Denise Collins, cleaned tables, refilled salt shakers, swept beneath the booths. The cook, a man named Ray Parsons, locked the back kitchen at 11:45 and left through the rear exit. The manager counted the register and departed at 11:52. Jennifer and Denise finished their closing duties. They walked together to the parking lot behind the diner. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s. Their breath hung visible in the air beneath a single streetlight that buzzed and flickered. Denise's car was parked closest to the building. Jennifer's car, a 1997 Honda Accord with a dented rear bumper and a crack across the windshield, sat at the far edge of the lot near the tree line. Denise would remember this moment with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. She called goodnight to Jennifer. Jennifer waved, didn't call back, walked toward her car with her keys already in her hand. Denise started her engine, waited for it to warm, glanced up to see Jennifer opening her car door, the interior light coming on. Then Denise looked down to adjust the heat, looked up again, and Jennifer's car was pulling out of the lot, taillights disappearing onto the main road. The time was exactly 12:03 in the morning, February 4th. Jennifer never made it home. Her mother called the house at 7 the next morning to ask when Jennifer would pick up the children. No answer. Called again at 7:30, 8 o'clock. By 8:15, Carol drove to the house on Maple Street, found the door locked, Jennifer's car absent from the driveway. She called Michael's cell phone. He didn't answer. She called the diner. They said Jennifer had left at closing time just after midnight. Carol called the sheriff's department at 8:32. Deputy Thomas Warren took the initial report. A missing 23-year-old woman, last seen leaving work 7 hours earlier. He drove to the Harris residence, confirmed the house was locked and empty. He contacted Michael Harris, who said he was on a job site 2 hours away, said Jennifer had seemed fine when he spoke to her yesterday morning, said she must have just gone somewhere without telling anyone. Deputy Warren filed a standard missing person report but didn't initiate a search. Young women sometimes took off for a day or two, he reasoned, especially young mothers who needed a break. But Carol Bennett insisted something was wrong. She knew her daughter. Jennifer would never leave her children, never disappear without a word, never abandon her responsibilities. Carol called the sheriff's department 4 more times that morning. By noon, deputies began searching. They drove the route from the diner to Jennifer's house looking for her car. They contacted hospitals. They called Jennifer's few friends. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. At 2:15 that afternoon, a logger named Dale Murphy was driving his truck down Forest Service Road 47, a gravel logging road that wound through dense timber 12 miles northeast of Riverside. He noticed a car parked on the shoulder, door hanging open, headlights on. He slowed, recognized it as abandoned, continued to a spot where he had cell service and called it in. Deputies arrived at 3:05. The car was Jennifer's Honda Accord. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the on position, battery dead from the headlights running for hours. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside with $43 and her driver's license. Her cell phone was on the floor of the passenger side. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than normal for someone Jennifer's height. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, nothing broken. Just a car, left running in the middle of nowhere. Part 2. The investigation. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department organized search teams before sunset. 40 volunteers showed up at the community center by 5 o'clock. Neighbors and coworkers and people who had never met Jennifer Harris but felt compelled to help. They divided into groups, assigned grid patterns through the forest surrounding the logging road where her car had been found. The terrain was difficult, thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock, the ground covered in sword ferns and salal that concealed the forest floor. The temperature dropped into the 20s after dark. Search teams carried flashlights, called Jennifer's name into the blackness, listened for any response. They found nothing that first night. No footprints leading away from the car. No torn clothing caught on branches. No signs that Jennifer had walked into the woods voluntarily or been dragged against her will. The forest simply swallowed their voices and gave nothing back. By morning, the search expanded. The county brought in tracking dogs who sniffed Jennifer's work apron and circled her car, noses to the ground, but picked up no scent trail leading away from the vehicle. Helicopters from the state patrol flew grid patterns overhead, thermal imaging cameras scanning the canopy below for any heat signature. Divers checked the Cascade River and the smaller creeks that fed into it. News crews arrived from Seattle, setting up cameras outside the sheriff's department, interviewing Carol Bennett, who stood trembling in her winter coat, begging anyone with information to come forward. The town responded with the fierce protectiveness small communities show when one of their own goes missing. The Riverside Diner became an unofficial headquarters where volunteers gathered for coffee and assignments. Local businesses printed missing person flyers with Jennifer's photo, the image from her driver's license where she wasn't smiling, just staring straight ahead with that distant look people would later remember. The flyers went up in every storefront window, on every telephone pole, at the post office and the library and the gas station at the highway junction. But beneath the community solidarity, questions began to surface. How had Jennifer's car ended up on Forest Service Road 47? The route made no sense. To get from the diner to her house, she should have turned left out of the parking lot onto Main Street, then right on Maple. Forest Service Road 47 was in the opposite direction, accessed by turning right out of the parking lot, driving 3 miles north on the highway, then turning onto a poorly marked gravel road. Why would Jennifer go there? Why in the middle of the night? Who else knew about that location? Deputies interviewed Denise Collins, the last person to see Jennifer. Denise described the parking lot, the moment Jennifer got into her car, the taillights disappearing. She was certain Jennifer had been alone. She was certain no other cars had been in the lot. But when deputies asked which direction Jennifer turned when she left, Denise paused. She thought Jennifer turned left toward home, but she couldn't be absolutely sure. She had been adjusting her heat, had looked down for just a moment. Investigators obtained Jennifer's cell phone records. Her last call had been at 11:15 that night, a 3-minute conversation with Michael Harris. When deputies questioned Michael about the call, he said Jennifer had phoned to say goodnight, to check that he had arrived safely at the job site. He said she sounded normal, maybe tired from her shift, but normal. He said they talked about picking up the children the next day, about what they needed from the grocery store. Nothing unusual. Nothing concerning. But something about Michael Harris bothered the deputies. Those who knew him said he seemed remarkably calm for a man whose wife had vanished without a trace. When deputies first contacted him at the job site on the morning of February 4th, he hadn't immediately driven home. He finished his workday, clocked out at 4:30, then made the 2-hour drive back to Riverside. When he arrived at the sheriff's department at 7 that evening, he appeared irritated more than worried, frustrated by the disruption to his schedule. Deputy Warren, who conducted the initial interview, would later note in his report that Michael showed no visible emotion when discussing Jennifer's disappearance. He sat with his arms crossed, answered questions in a flat monotone, checked his watch repeatedly. When asked if he had any idea where Jennifer might have gone, he shrugged and said she probably ran off with someone. When asked why he would think that, he said Jennifer had always been flighty, unreliable, the kind of person who didn't think through consequences. Carol Bennett, listening to this characterization from the hallway outside the interview room, had to be physically restrained by another deputy. She called Michael a liar, called him worse things, said her daughter would never abandon her children, said Michael knew something he wasn't telling. Michael emerged from the interview room, walked past Carol without making eye contact, drove home to the empty house on Maple Street. Investigators searched the Harris residence on February 6th. They found nothing suspicious. The house was messy but not abnormally so for a family with 2 young children. Toys scattered across the living room floor, dishes in the sink, laundry piled in baskets. Jennifer's clothes were in the bedroom closet. Her toothbrush was in the bathroom. Her winter coat, the one Carol said she wore everywhere, hung on a hook by the front door. If Jennifer had left voluntarily, she had taken almost nothing with her. Deputies questioned neighbors. Had anyone seen or heard anything unusual on the night of February 3rd? Most people had been asleep, but Mrs. Helen Cross, who lived 2 houses down from the Harris family, mentioned that she often heard shouting from their house, doors slamming, sometimes late at night. She said Michael and Jennifer fought frequently, said she had once seen Jennifer standing in the driveway in her bathrobe at 2 in the morning, crying while Michael's truck pulled away. When confronted with this information, Michael admitted he and Jennifer argued sometimes, said all couples fought, said it didn't mean anything. He maintained he had been 2 hours away when Jennifer disappeared, and the job site foreman confirmed Michael had clocked in at 7:30 the morning of February 4th, meaning he would have had to leave the Everett area by 5:30 at the latest to arrive on time. Jennifer hadn't left work until after midnight. The timeline didn't allow for Michael to have been involved. The sheriff's department verified his alibi, confirmed it was solid. But investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They examined Jennifer's car more closely. The forensics team found no fingerprints other than Jennifer's on the steering wheel and door handles. They found no signs of another person having been in the vehicle, but they did find something odd. The odometer showed Jennifer's car had traveled approximately 17 miles since her last gas station fill-up 2 days earlier. The distance from the diner to the location where her car was found measured 14.3 miles. The distance from the diner to her house was 2.1 miles. If Jennifer had driven straight from work to the logging road, the mileage fit. But if she had gone anywhere else first, stopped anywhere, met anyone, the numbers didn't add up. Deputies retraced every possible route. They drove from the diner to the logging road multiple times, testing different paths, checking the mileage. Every route measured between 13.8 and 14.6 miles. The odometer reading suggested Jennifer had driven almost directly from work to the spot where her car was abandoned, with perhaps one brief stop along the way. But why? That was the question no one could answer. Why would Jennifer Harris, exhausted from an 8-hour shift, drive in the opposite direction from her home, alone in the middle of the night, to a remote logging road where she had no apparent reason to be? The search continued for 3 weeks. Volunteers walked every trail within a 10-mile radius of the abandoned car. They searched ravines and creek beds and old mining shafts. They knocked on doors of remote cabins and asked hunters if they had seen anything unusual. The sheriff's department issued appeals for information, set up a tip line that rang constantly with calls from psychics and conspiracy theorists, and people who thought they had seen Jennifer in grocery stores 3 states away. None of it led anywhere. By the end of February, the active search was scaled back. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that this would likely become a body recovery operation, not a rescue. They believed Jennifer Harris was deceased, had been since the night she disappeared, probably somewhere in the vast forest that surrounded Riverside. They just didn't know where or how or why. The case grew cold. Not officially, never officially, but in the way cases do when leads evaporate and weeks turn into months. Investigators moved on to other emergencies, other crimes. The news crews packed up their cameras. The missing person flyers faded in storefront windows, sun-bleached and curling at the edges. Michael Harris returned to work. Carol Bennett took custody of Emma and Tyler. Life in Riverside continued, but with a shadow over it, an unanswered question that hung in the air like morning fog that never quite burned off. Part 3: The Silence. 6 months after Jennifer disappeared, Michael Harris moved to Spokane. He told people he couldn't stay in Riverside anymore, couldn't drive past the diner where Jennifer had worked, couldn't sleep in the house where her absence filled every room. He packed his belongings, loaded them into his truck, and left on a Wednesday morning in August without saying goodbye to Carol Bennett or asking about his children. Emma and Tyler stayed with their grandmother in the same small house where Jennifer had grown up. Carol converted the spare bedroom into a room for the children, painted it yellow, bought twin beds from a second-hand store. She enrolled Emma in kindergarten that fall, took Tyler to preschool 3 mornings a week. She tried to create normalcy, routine, safety. But the children carried their mother's absence like a weight no 5-year-old and 3-year-old should have to bear. Emma stopped talking about her mother after the first year. When other children at school drew pictures for Mother's Day, Emma drew a picture of a blank face with no features, just an outline of a head with long hair. Her teacher, concerned, showed the drawing to the school counselor. The counselor met with Emma, asked gentle questions about her family, about what she remembered. Emma said she didn't remember anything, said her mother went away, said her father got mad a lot. Then she stopped talking altogether and asked to go back to class. Tyler was too young to articulate what he had lost. He had nightmares, woke screaming in the darkness, couldn't explain what he had seen in his dreams. He clung to Carol during the day, refused to let her out of his sight, panicked if she left the room even for a moment. The pediatrician said it was separation anxiety, trauma response, perfectly normal given the circumstances. Give it time, the doctor said. Children are resilient. But those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have ever felt the cognitive dissonance between what you want to believe and what some quiet voice inside you knows to be true, understand that time doesn't always heal. Sometimes time just gives wounds space to fester unseen. Carol thought about Michael constantly. She had never liked him, had tried to talk Jennifer out of marrying him when they were both still teenagers. Michael had always been controlling, possessive, the kind of man who needed to know where Jennifer was every minute of the day. Carol remembered the phone calls during their marriage, Michael calling the house 5, 6, 7 times a day, demanding to know why Jennifer wasn't answering, accusing her of things Carol knew weren't true. She remembered Jennifer making excuses, saying Michael just loved her so much, saying he was just worried about her. After Jennifer vanished, Carol had contacted the sheriff's department multiple times, insisting they look more closely at Michael. But his alibi was ironclad. He had been 2 hours away. The timeline didn't work. Deputies had investigated him thoroughly, they assured her, and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Carol had to accept that, had to believe the evidence, even though every instinct screamed otherwise. The years passed, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Emma became a teenager, quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in her room with the door closed. Tyler struggled in school, fell in with troubled friends, got suspended for fighting. Carol tried her best, but she was in her 60s now, exhausted, grieving a daughter who had never been found, raising grandchildren who flinched at loud noises and looked over their shoulders in parking lots. Michael remarried in 2009. His new wife was named Patricia, a woman he had met at a job site in Spokane. They had a child together, a daughter. Michael posted photos on social media, his new family at barbecues and birthday parties, everyone smiling, the past seemingly forgotten. He never contacted Emma or Tyler, never called on their birthdays, never sent Christmas cards. It was as if his first family had simply ceased to exist. But in 2018, something shifted. Emma, now 17 years old, had started seeing a therapist. Her school had recommended it after she was found cutting herself in the bathroom during lunch period. The therapist worked with Emma for months, slowly building trust, creating a space where Emma felt safe enough to speak. And in one session in November of that year, Emma said something she had never said before. She said she remembered the night her mother disappeared. Not all of it, but pieces, fragments. She remembered waking up to shouting her father's voice, loud and angry. She remembered hiding under her blankets, the sound of a door slamming, an engine starting. She remembered creeping to the window and seeing her father's truck pulling out of the driveway, taillights disappearing down Maple Street. She remembered looking at her Disney princess clock on the nightstand, the one that glowed in the dark. The time had been 12:15 in the morning, February 4th, 2004. But that was impossible. Michael had been in Everett. He had clocked in at work at 7:30 that morning. The timeline didn't allow for him to have been in Riverside at 12:15, to have driven to Everett, and to have arrived by 7:30. It was a 2-hour drive under normal conditions. The math simply didn't work. Unless the timeline was wrong, unless someone had made a mistake, unless Michael had never been in Everett that night at all. The therapist, bound by confidentiality, couldn't go to the police without Emma's permission. She worked with Emma for weeks, helping her process the memory, validate what she had experienced, build the courage to come forward. In January 2019, Emma finally agreed to speak to investigators. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department reopened Jennifer Harris's case on January 23, 2019, 15 years after she had vanished. Detective Sarah Chen, who had joined the department in 2010 and knew the case only from the files, was assigned to lead the investigation. She met with Emma Bennett, now 18 years old, in a quiet conference room with soft lighting and a box of tissues on the table. Emma told her story haltingly, stopping frequently to breathe, to wipe her eyes, to steady herself. She described waking to shouting, described her father's voice, the words she couldn't make out but the rage she could feel even through her bedroom wall. Described the door slam, the engine, the truck leaving. Described the clock reading 12:15. She was 5 years old when it happened, she said, but she remembered it clearly. Had always remembered it but had been too frightened to tell anyone, afraid of what it might mean, afraid her father would find out, afraid of being wrong. Detective Chen listened without interruption. When Emma finished, Chen asked careful questions. Was Emma certain it was the night her mother disappeared? Was she certain of the time? Could she describe anything else she remembered from that night? Emma nodded. She was certain. The next morning her grandmother had arrived looking for her mother, and Emma had known, even at 5 years old, that something terrible had happened. Chen pulled the original case file. She reviewed the timeline investigators had constructed in 2004. According to the file, Michael Harris had called Jennifer at 11:15 on the night of February 3rd. He claimed to have been at a motel in Everett, said he had gone to bed shortly after the call. The job site foreman confirmed Michael clocked in at 7:30 the next morning. Deputies had verified the motel receipt. Michael had paid for a room on February 3rd. Everything checked out. But Chen noticed something the original investigators had missed or dismissed. The motel receipt showed Michael had checked in at 6:45 in the evening on February 3rd. It showed he had paid for one night. But there was no record of him actually staying in the room. No one had seen him there after check-in. The front desk clerk who had been working that night was interviewed in 2004 and said he didn't remember Michael coming or going. Said guests came and went all the time through the side entrance. Said he couldn't confirm whether Michael had spent the night or not. Chen did the math. If Michael had checked into the motel at 6:45, he could have left immediately afterward. The drive from Everett to Riverside took approximately 2 hours. He could have arrived back in Riverside by 9 o'clock, been there when Jennifer got home from work just after midnight, had time to do whatever he had done, and driven back to Everett by 2:30 or 3 in the morning, arrived before sunrise, shown up for work at 7:30 looking tired but present. The timeline worked. Barely, but it worked. If Michael had driven fast, if he had taken back roads to avoid being seen, if he had planned it carefully. Chen contacted the construction company where Michael had worked in 2004. She asked for employment records, time cards, anything that might show more precisely when Michael had arrived that morning. The company, now under different ownership, had archived records in a storage facility. It took 3 weeks to locate the files. When they arrived, Chen found something interesting. Michael's time card for February 4, 2004, showed he had clocked in at 7:30, but the handwriting was shaky, the numbers slightly smudged, and there was a note in the margin, barely legible, that read, "Arrived late, wet clothes." Chen tracked down the foreman who had been in charge of the job site in 2004. His name was Robert Tillman, now retired and living in Oregon. Chen called him, identified herself, asked if he remembered Michael Harris. Tillman was quiet for a long moment. Then he said yes, he remembered Michael. Said Michael had shown up that morning looking like he hadn't slept, clothes damp like he had been out in the rain, mud on his boots. Tillman had asked if everything was okay. Michael had said he was fine, had just gotten up early to drive, had stopped for coffee and spilled it on himself. Tillman hadn't thought much of it at the time, but later, after he heard about Michael's wife going missing, he wondered. He wondered but didn't say anything, didn't want to accuse someone without proof, didn't want to get involved. For those who have ever felt the weight of silence, of knowing something might be wrong but convincing yourself it's not your place to speak, Tillman's regret was palpable through the phone line. He told Chen he had thought about it for years, that moment, Michael's wet clothes, the exhaustion in his eyes. He said he should have said something. Chen told him he was saying something now, and it mattered. Armed with this new information, Detective Chen obtained a warrant to search Michael Harris's property in Spokane. The search took place on March 15, 2019, at 6 in the morning. Michael answered the door in his pajamas, his new wife standing behind him with their daughter in her arms. He claimed not to know what this was about, said the investigation into Jennifer's disappearance had concluded years ago, said he had been cleared. Chen informed him the case had been reopened. She asked if he would be willing to come to the station to answer some questions. Michael refused, said he had nothing to say, said he wanted a lawyer. Investigators searched the house and Michael's truck. They found nothing directly linking him to Jennifer's disappearance, but in a box in the garage they found something unexpected, a receipt from a hardware store in Riverside, dated February 3, 2004 at 8:47 in the evening. The receipt was for a tarp, rope, and a shovel. Michael had been in Riverside that night. The motel receipt and the hardware store receipt proved he had lied about his whereabouts. Part 4. The Revelation. The arrest came on April 2, 2019. Detective Chen, accompanied by 2 other deputies, arrived at Michael Harris's workplace in Spokane at 4 in the afternoon. Michael was walking to his truck when they approached. Chen identified herself, informed Michael he was under arrest for the suspected homicide of Jennifer Harris. Michael's face went pale. He didn't resist, didn't speak. Simply stood there as Chen read him his rights, placed handcuffs around his wrists, guided him into the back of the patrol car. The news spread through Riverside within hours. After 15 years, someone was finally being held accountable for Jennifer's disappearance. Carol Bennett collapsed in her kitchen when she received the phone call from Detective Chen. "Emma, now living in her own apartment, drove immediately to her grandmother's house. They held each other and cried, not from relief exactly, but from the confirmation of something they had always known but could never prove. Michael Harris was extradited back to Riverside County. He was charged with second-degree homicide, despite the fact that Jennifer's body had never been found. The prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Moore, argued the evidence was circumstantial but compelling. She built her case methodically, piece by piece, showing the jury the timeline, the lies, the hardware store receipt, the wet clothes, Emma's testimony about hearing her father leave the house in the middle of the night. The defense argued the evidence proved nothing. Michael's lawyer, a seasoned criminal attorney from Seattle named Gerald Benson, insisted the timeline was still impossible, that Michael couldn't have driven to Riverside, harmed Jennifer, disposed of her body, and returned to Everett in time for work. He argued the hardware store receipt meant nothing, that Michael could have stopped in Riverside briefly that evening before continuing to Everett, that there was no law against buying supplies. He argued Emma's memory was unreliable, that she had been 5 years old, that 15 years had passed, that she was confusing events or fabricating details to match what she wanted to believe. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence. In April 2019, while Michael was in custody awaiting trial, investigators searched Forest Service Road 47 again, this time with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They focused on an area approximately 100 yards from where Jennifer's car had been found, a dense section of forest where the undergrowth was particularly thick. On May 18, 2019, the cadaver dogs alerted on a specific location. Investigators began excavating. 3 feet below the surface, wrapped in a blue tarp, they found human remains. The body was severely decomposed, identification through visual means impossible. But DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Jennifer Harris. The forensic pathologist determined the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a heavy object, possibly the shovel purchased at the hardware store. The tarp was consistent with the type sold at hardware stores in 2004. Traces of soil on the tarp matched soil, samples from the Harris residence on Maple Street. Michael Harris had killed his wife in their home on the night of February 3, 2004, shortly after she returned from her shift at the diner. He had wrapped her body in a tarp, placed her in his truck, driven to the remote logging road he knew from years of hunting in the area, and buried her in a shallow grave. He had then taken Jennifer's car, driven it back to the logging road, left it running with the door open to suggest she had vanished of her own accord or met with foul play from a stranger. He had driven back to Everett, arrived before dawn, changed his clothes, and showed up for work as if nothing had happened. He had almost gotten away with it. Would have gotten away with it if not for a 17-year-old girl who finally found the courage to speak, a detective who noticed details others had overlooked, and a retired foreman who decided, 15 years too late, that silence was no longer an option. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Riverside County Courthouse had never seen such crowds. Every seat in the gallery was filled, people lined up outside hopping for a chance to witness justice. Carol Bennett attended every day, sitting in the front row with Emma beside her. Tyler, now 21, couldn't bring himself to enter the courtroom, waited instead in the hallway, packing, chain-smoking cigarettes outside the building. On July 12, 2019, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree homicide. Michael Harris showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He simply stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, while his current wife sobbed in the row behind him. Emma gripped her grandmother's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, A woman who had presided over cases in Riverside County for 23 years addressed Michael directly. She spoke about Jennifer, about the young woman who had never gotten the chance to watch her children grow up, who had died afraid and alone in her own home at the hands of someone who had promised to love and protect her. She spoke about the 15 years of deception, the cruelty of letting Jennifer's family wonder and hope and grieve without answers. She sentenced Michael Harris to 43 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2054. He will be 87 years old. Most likely, he will die in prison, just as Jennifer died in their home, just as she spent 15 years buried in the forest while he built a new life and pretended the old one had never existed. Closing. The case of Jennifer Harris stands as a testament to the power of persistence, to the importance of listening when victims' families insist something is wrong, to the truth that justice, even delayed by 15 years, matters. Jennifer's remains were finally laid to rest in Riverside Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town where she spent her entire life. Emma and Tyler stood beside their grandmother as the casket was lowered into the ground, finally able to say the goodbye they had been denied in 2004. The swing in the backyard of the house on Maple Street hung still. The toy truck lay on its side in the grass, exactly where Tyler had left it the morning his mother disappeared. Someone else lives in that house now, but the memory of what happened there remains, etched into the foundation, a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.